All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Unbreaking Science. My name is Dr. James Lyons-Weiler, coming to you from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm extremely excited about what we're going to be doing today with Unbreaking Science. I have a lot of questions about why medical genetics doesn't quite do what it should be doing, and look at all the factors that it should be looking at. And to help me answer these questions, we have today Dr. Kendra Becker. Dr. Kendra Becker is an integrated physician practicing for over 10 years. She's in Hartford, Connecticut. She's Connecticut's 4A specialist: asthma, autism, allergies, atopy, and eczema. She holds ND degrees and MS, and she's an APRN. She's board certified in both areas. Her specialties include MTHFR, fertility, and treatment of the I already did that. Dr. Becker focuses primarily treating the pediatric population and their parents. So she's a family physician. Dr. Becker is adjunct faculty at two prominent universities where she teaches physicians and precept students, doctor, nurses, and nurse practitioners. Dr. Becker lectures all over the country on topics such as autism, the immune system, MTHFR, and genetic mutations that have health implications, and keeping healing in the home. Dr. Becker is the author of A Delicious Way to Heal the Gut, and released her second book, All You Can Eat. I have her recipe book. I can't wait to try out some of her recipes. And she releases in May 2018. I'll be showing you the title page of that book so you can identify it. Dr. Becker was chosen as one of Connecticut's top naturopathic doctors and 10 best, and there's no doubt why she was chosen. Wait till you listen and hear and learn with me from Dr. Kendra Becker. Welcome, Kendra.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited not only to be here, but also to learn from you, because I think you have so much to contribute on this issue as well.
Yeah, thanks. We're going to get under the hood here pretty deep, and I know a lot of people are looking towards us playing some intellectual badminton here. So, you're brilliant. You're absolutely brilliant, way ahead of the curve on this. And so, we have to go through some of the basics for some of the people that don't know what MTHFR is. Maybe you're a parent that has a new child with autoimmunity, a young child with autism, and you've never heard about MTHFR and why it's important, but you hear people talking about it. So why don't you, tell us about MTHFR and why some families might want to know their status of this gene and the various genotypes that are in play.
Sure. So MTHFR is one of the 20,000 genes, or a combination of over the 8 billion gene combinations that we have in our genome. And this particular gene codes for an enzyme that's called methyl tetrahydroxyfolate reductase. That particular enzyme helps the body, breakdown would be the word, and utilize folate in a bioavailable form. In order to do that, we need B12, we need B6, and the end result of this particular pathway, looking at it just solitarily like we were driving down a road straight, would be to actually produce glutathione and reduce oxidative stress or damage to our cells. So that's kind of the 5-second elevator speech about the importance of MTHFR.
Okay, cool. So let me on behalf of the listeners who are novices to this, can I ask you just to back up a little bit, and let's talk about folate. And it bothers me a little bit that the product labeling around commercial products, food products, and so on, is very confusing to the consumer about what. So we have, what is folate? How is it related to folic acid? And what is, why is vitamin, B9? Is it supposed to be yes. B9? So why do
that's folate.
Why do the official narratives on, since there are two different chemical structures, why do the different the official narratives and the descriptions online describe both folate and folic acid as vitamin B9? How do they get away with calling it the same thing?
I knew I loved you from the beginning. So here's the thing. So folic acid is actually a chemical. It's a pharmaceutical used in the lab. So folate is what we find in our kale and our dark green leafy vegetables, and it's widely available and bioavailable to the human body. So I believe it was 1956, 50 something that folic acid was actually created in a lab. So then there was a bit of a backdoor deal with the FDA and all of the several of the agricultural farmers, the grain manufacturers in America, to get together. And I believe it was 1986, if I'm not mistaken, and folic acid was mandated by the FDA to be included enriched in all grains that were processed and manufactured in the U.S. So then what happened was sometime between 50
I'm sorry, you mean grain products. You mean products.
Grain products.
So processed food with grain products. They added folic acid and they were going to save the world because
Correct.
of spina bifida. That was their reasoning, right? You have spina bifida
Correct.
and it helps with the closure of the neural tube.
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
So, I mean, and we have to kind of unpack that to begin with, right? So we know that mothers in particular, fathers as well, but in a lesser percentage, that have MTHFR have a higher risk of having a baby that has Down syndrome, spina bifida, and a variety of midline defects, which is anything that happens literally down the center of the body. So, lip tie, tongue tie, thyroid problems, cardiac problems, digestive problems, reproductive problems, and you can see all, and then on the back, spinal problems. So these are all things that we see all the way down the center of the body. So there was some research that came out in the early 50s showing that in certain populations, women that had less folate, the natural form, had higher incidences of spina bifida and these midline defects that they had recorded by research. So sometime between 50 and 80, when, the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers started to get involved with medical school and start rewriting pharmaceutical, textbooks to kind of really promote a pharmaceutical agenda, the vernacular was really changed in medical school and subsequently passed along with doctors to really interchangeably use the word folate and folic acid, which then basically became this place where the word folate was really dropped. The natural biological form that was created by nature had really been almost erased from our language, and we instead replaced it with folic acid, which is synthetic and a pharmaceutical. So then the magical folic acid, like you said, kind of went to this, was enriched in any kind of processed foods. Remember, Bruce Jenner and Doug Flutie and all of these magical strong men were on the cover of all these, breakfast cereals that were enriched with folic acid, and that was part of the selling point. So folic acid became very much a part of our culture, and only good mothers that were intending on getting pregnant, took folic acid. Then in the late 90s, I believe, there was a study that came out that showed, mostly because women at that time had started having babies later, there was a study that came out that said if you're over 35, you have old eggs and you should take 5 milligrams of folic acid, and this will miraculously turn your old eggs back into young eggs and will kind of hedge your bets as far as the reduction of risk of neural tube defects in a pregnancy. And so quite honestly, I don't know if you want to know a whole lot about me, but I fell into that path. I was 33 when I was 32 when I got pregnant the first time, and I was in medical school, and I was going to do everything that I possibly could to have a healthy baby. And I took 5 milligrams of folic acid every day because that's really what the research supported. Well, I miscarried my first baby at 14 weeks. Then I miscarried my second baby at 14 weeks because I was taking more folic acid the second time to avoid that horrible incident of happening. Mm-hmm. So conveniently, and for me, I tend to be pretty religious. I really believe I got a message from God. I was sitting in front of my computer and I got emails from the 4 or 5 supplement companies that I was using at the time and selling in my office. And that's around the time, so it was about 2005, when all the research came out finally that said folic acid and folate are not the same thing. The body doesn't recognize it the same way. The body doesn't utilize it the same way. And what is happening with that is that individuals that are positive for MTHFR, that are consuming a ton of folic acid, affected like I was actually create inflammation and cause more harm than good. So I promptly threw away the prenatal I was taking, took one that had methylfolate, got pregnant very quickly right after that with my daughter, and 3 years later got pregnant right after that with my son. So for me, it was this, oh my gosh, change, love, forgive. I hope I don't have cancer kind of a thing. But it was very much directly a cause and effect. And so what I believe happened to me and probably many other people out there is the fact that what we did is if we're positive for MTHFR, the body doesn't recognize folic acid. It becomes inflammatory in the body, just like fractionated oils do, or chemicals, or anything else that the body recognizes as being inflammatory. Inflammation, literally that folic acid got stuck in my folate receptors. And when that happens, folate receptors kind of look like champagne glasses. And so all the folic acid was like sitting on the top of my receptors, and it was blocking my body's ability to give the proper cell signaling to develop my babies.
Okay, so we'll get to the complex nature of what that means with the MTHFR pathway in a little bit.
Sure.
But I have a question for you.
Sure.
Let's say that you're in charge of the World Health Organization. You're an advisor. You're an advisor, at least, to Brazil, and it's say 5 or 6 years ago. 2008, 2012, somewhere around there. Mm-hmm. And you decide that you're going to recommend prenatal vitamins to all women in Brazil for the first time in history. What do you expect is going to happen in Brazil?
Depends on what's in the prenatal.
It's
really.
Folic acid.
If it's folic acid, you're going to have huge problems with neural tube defects, in my opinion. There are certain populations that have a very, very high incidence of MTHFR mutations. Mexicans, Filipinos, South Americans have a higher percentage. Italians, if you have pure Italian blood, your incidence of having 2 copies of C677T is almost 100%.
Okay, so the reason why I ask is because that's what happened. They unleashed the Stork program, and they put folic acid into all these moms, right? And this was before Zika virus got to Brazil, and there was an uptick in microcephaly a couple of years before the Zika virus got to Brazil. The timeline is wrong on their narrative. And I have a manuscript on that Peter Hotez said was not useful. It was not a useful contribution because, I imagine because it was too truthful. But all right, so you're a mom, and you've got 2 kids. Congratulations. And we're looking at a increasingly toxic world with all different kinds of toxins. And tell us a little bit about the MTHFR pathway with respect to detoxification, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, absolutely. So again, even like with my personal story, if there are things that the body can't recognize, and we'll use the MTHFR pathway specifically, folic acid happens to be one of them, but toxicity in general can do the same thing to those little folate receptors. The toxicity gets stuck in those little receptors because the enzyme is impaired. Depending on the mutation that you can have an impairment of almost 90% of functioning of that enzyme. So that means in somebody who needs 100% of that particular pathway to work effectively, you're getting 10% of that. So clearly, if you're not able to execute your pathway properly, then what ends up happening is you have a buildup of toxicity in the body. So in this case, because humans are always inclined to survive, we store our toxicity in areas of the body that are less harmful. So we don't store it in the heart, we don't store it in the liver most of the time, but we can get to that in a little bit. And so what happens is most humans store their toxicity in their fat. So I know a good amount of adults generally have a little fat, a little extra to share, but in kids, the fattiest part of their little bodies is their brain and their spinal cord. So a lot of this toxicity, if their bodies are impaired as far as detox goes, definitely store these things in their brains and in their spinal cords. And I think that speaks very personally, particularly in the autism community with little boys, and how, heavy metals and toxicity get encapsulated in testosterone, and then that testosterone goes right to the brain. So, and you
You're
know, Bob
just a
Kennedy's
wealth of information. So I read 2,000 studies, and I did not run into testosterone-carrying metals. That's fascinating. That's cool.
Yeah.
I
Absolutely.
didn't know that. So I hope you send me that reference. I'm very interested in sharing that.
Okay, perfect.
I'm a metals guy myself. We have a publication that's just been accepted on the chronic toxicity of aluminum implied by the pediatric vaccine schedule. That's coming out. So again, for the novices who are kind of new to MTHFR and the people that know all about it and they want to get to the goods, hold on, the goods are coming. The goods are coming.
Yeah.
We're going to get right down to
Absolutely.
the more complex, in-depth analysis. But we do need to do the favor of talking a bit, if you don't mind, about the MTHFR pathway, specifically with respect to its basic functions in the body and what it does. I'm going to cut to a version of the pathway from mygenefood.com. I'm going to take away my icon because I didn't create that. That's not implied intellectual contribution there. But let's go over the pathway a little bit of, say, in a functioning a normal, quote-unquote normal person that has canonical, well, it's hard to say canonical because the majority of the variation that is there is meant to deal with toxins from plants and so on. But what's the source of folate? Let's start with the source of folate right here at the top, if we could.
Okay. Yep.
In the diet. What's the normal, natural sources of folate?
Kale.
Kale.
Dark green leafy vegetables.
All right, cool. So eat your veggies, and it comes into this pathway here after being digested. And what is this loop of the pathway doing here? What does THF stand for? Do you remember?
I can't see that part because that's where my picture is, and I'm afraid to move anything. But
Okay.
THF is the tetrahydrofolate.
Oh yeah, tetrahydrofolate, right. So then you end up with 510, it gets modified into 510 methyl tetrahydrofolate, and that's a conversion that uses a serine HMT. So then if you have 510 methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase deficiency, which is another genetic variant that comes in here with the if your reductase if the enzyme that reduces that is deficient, you can end up with hyperhomocysteemia. I know that much, but that's through the pathway. So the people that are processing these toxins are relying on this part of the pathway to do exactly what in terms of toxins?
So this part of the pathway basically, so as you see here with the MTHFR down below, you need the conversion of the methylfolate to be able to help, along with B12 and B1 and B2, to be able to help break down the homocysteine, which is an inflammatory marker. If that doesn't happen, to your point, your homocysteine levels can get very, very high. And high levels of homocysteine are a cardiovascular marker, number one, but number two, they do cause, it's an inflammation marker. So it puts us in a state of higher and more chronic levels of inflammation.
So your B6s come from what type of food naturally?
Liver, almonds, those sorts of things.
Okay,
so,
and then B2.
Meat,
Go ahead. Meat.
like
right.
meat.
Right, so that makes sense. From an omnivore kind of diet, we have that.
Correct.
B6 is kind of normal. And then B2, what's a normal source of that, if you recall?
So B2, again, is the same sort of thing. You're looking for dark green leafy vegetables. You're looking for animal proteins. You're looking for things like avocado, almonds are my favorite, that sort of a thing.
Sure. So the wonder meats that are coming out in the fast food restaurants probably won't add much to the B6, but they might have some the miracle meats that they call them, whatever. So what is the variation here? The C677T. That means that there's a cysteine at the 677th location in the gene that is transformed or was mutated, or you inherited a variant that is a thiamine. And then you have an adenine at the 1,298 position that's you're actually carrying cytosine instead of an adenine. So for those of you that look at these genotypes and we talk about it like everybody knows it, these genotypes, a genotype is a representation, is the actual your genetic disposition, what genes, genetic variation you're carrying, and we call them SNPs. I tend to shy away from SNPs because I've been at science too long, and I remember when SNPs were supposed to be anonymous. But these are polymorphisms that exist, right? That and they're pretty high frequency, these polymorphisms. And we're going to come back. This is going to be a theme throughout our talk today. They're pretty high frequency, and so I almost call them non-canonical, but they're actually normal genetic variation that in the human population. We don't see high frequency genetic variants that maintain themselves in the in the population unless they're not deleterious in the environment in which we expect to see. And so now we've got 5-MTH, and then we're going to go to the methionine synthetase and enter the second loop. Can you tell us what the second loop might be doing here?
Yeah, absolutely. But I want to talk first about MTHFR and just follow up on one of the things that you said is, like you said, the genetic polymorphisms really means this is a natural occurrence across our population. So if we have a natural occurrence across our population, I mean, as humans, aren't we supposed to celebrate like diversity? Why are we not celebrating genetic diversity? I find it really fascinating because there was some older research, and I don't know exactly the date, that showed that these populations, like the Italians, for example, and the Filipinos, didn't have this high level of genetic expression 50 or 60 years ago. So there are some theories, most of them mine, just, to preface that really shows that I think a lot of these genes are expressing themselves to really protect their individual organism from toxicity. I mean, it makes perfect sense, right? Like if you step in a hole and sprain your ankle, what happens? Your ankle gets swollen, right? It's inflammation.
And you feel pain, and the pain is adaptive because you're not going to further injure the tissue.
Exactly correct. I think the same thing is going on in our genes. But the problem is that our society is so toxic that this level of inflammation that is being afforded in these cells and in the cell membrane is actually causing harm instead of good because there is no period of restoration for the cells. So that's the first point. My second point is, just like you said, those two different polymorphisms, those two different versions of the MTHFR mutation can be any number of combinations. So you can have 2 copies of C677T, 2 copies of 1298C, or a combination of the two, or one of one and not of the other, or one of one and not of the other. So, as far as genetics go, if you're a parent, you have 2 copies of the MTHFR and your partner has 2 copies of the MTHFR that are different, you have, just like regular old 9th grade biology, you have a 1 in 25 chance of any of those combinations to pass on to your children. So it's always funny in my practice when parents come in and their kids have 2 copies of MTHFR and they're like, oh, my husband gave that to him, didn't he? And I'm like, well, yeah, you did too. So anyway, so we'll focus a little bit, we'll go back to the pathway and we'll focus a little bit on the 2 copies, the homozygous C677T, largely because that's where all of the medical literature and research is right now. And that really is showing to have much higher implications as far as detox pathways, homocysteine levels, glutathione levels, and just outcomes in general. Post-surgery, pharmaceuticals, and things like that.
Cool. So yes. I feel that it's important that people understand that you're entitled to be born with whatever genetic makeup your ancestors had. Correct. Right? We're not in a period of eugenics where corporate toxins should be a major selective force on the human population. We need to look at what we allow corporations to regulate themselves. I don't know if you saw that movie Dark Waters by Mark Ruffalo. Have you seen it?
Yeah.
Fantastic film. Yeah, fantastic film. Where it tells the story of how the company was allowed to regulate themselves, and so they would do their own toxicity studies, and they were only a violation of the law if they released toxins to a certain level in the environment that were beyond the toxicity, so the levels that they determined for themselves. I mean, what a dream come true. Okay, so if you don't do any science, you don't do any toxicology, or if you do it poorly, then you can say, okay, well, this is safe, right? And it sounds familiar. I've seen this is safe. I've heard, we hear that a lot these days. But back to the pathway. Thank you for taking us through this then. So we've got 1 or 2 or various combinations of very genetic variants, and I hear a lot of people saying they're born with 2 different variants, 3 different variants, multiple hits on that, and then methionine synthase is an enzyme that is aided by B12, And this part of the cycle then brings us to methionine, and that's where your methylation's coming in, right? So the CPG islands, then this is where the whole thing explodes to have many, many, many physiological effects. Why MTHFR variation is so important in so many ways. So let's just do a bullet check of the different types of human physiology and health where MTHFR variation can be expected to impact people.
Right, and I think your pathway does a really great job at showing that, because if you look to the right, what do you have there? You have dimethylglycine and betaine. That's basically digestion, right? And if you go south on your pathway to cystathionine and cysteine, what's that? That's basically neurotransmitters or neurofunctioning. So the truth of the matter is MTHFR affects all of that. And if you go down a couple of more steps below cysteine, what you're also doing is ultimately the whole goal of methylation and the whole intended outcome is to produce glutathione, which glutathione, as we all know, is the number one, basically the only thing that our cell membranes have to be able to repair themselves, which certainly brings us to a much larger conversation about pharmaceuticals, Tylenol, and all of the well-reported worldwide research about how we know that Tylenol and paracetamol are the number one glutathione precursor, or number one glutathione depleters. Right. And so here we are removing, any cellular ability of our bodies to protect ourselves by actually giving Tylenol or taking Tylenol.
Absolutely. So looking at the pathway then over here, you've got betaine and homocysteine and the dimethylglycine. What's that part of the pathway, just to do a complete job here on what's on the screen?
Okay. Oh, so anyway, the betaine is one of the components of hydrochloric acid. And so, there's another couple of cofactors that we need there. We need a little zinc, we need a little biotin, those sorts of things help the body develop betaine properly. And of course, we know that there are people that are positive for MTHFR that have impaired digestive functioning. And in a lot of cases, those are reasons that people end up showing up in my office, is their digestion's never been right. Or, worse, they've had some sort of insult, from whatever, some environmental insult, and now their digestion is totally off. And then, of course, going south, to cysteine and looking at that pathway, that really helps and is some of the precursors to the development of neurotransmitters, which we know the bulk of them are actually developed in the gut with proper cell signaling. And so if we don't have proper cell signaling, or we're nutrient depleted, neurotransmitters aren't going to be developed properly. And that leads to a whole host of issues that we're seeing, across our nation and the world.
Very cool. So I'm going to thank you for that. So I'm going to cut to a slide from my autism talk. I gave this talk a few years ago after digesting all of the literature that I did. And MTHFR, CBS, and COMT show up in this pre and perinatal vitamin part of this environmental toxin liability sampling theory. And I use the word liability because that's what geneticists talk about. They talk about genetic versus environment liability. It's not parental liability, corporate liability. It's just the word that they use. But this whole thing is a part of a big puzzle where you have a lot of different toxins, all of these different different colored toxins in the environment are there because we don't really care to take care of what we do with corporate toxins and the products that are manufactured, and certainly the safety testing is almost never done. But what this diagram represents is that for various types of genes for which we have some association with autism, PON1, valproic acid, ADRB2, ERAP1, MET, we have a known environmental pair that appears to combine with that gene to increase risk of autism. And the science is there. This is all based on science that matches the gene to the environment. And in MTHFR, we have pre and perinatal vitamins, but there's got to be other things other than folic acid that can mess up your MTHFR pathway. Is that right?
Oh, totally. And it all depends. I mean, like I said, it's one of 20,000 genes, one of 8 billion gene combinations. Right. So, and it's really interesting, of course, based on some of the work I do, of course, I see vaccine injured children in the office and, people looking for medical exemptions. And that's, as you know, a whole nother podcast or maybe 3-day conference. I'm not quite sure. And what is happening there is people are coming in and they're like, I'm positive for MTHFR. Can you write me a medical exemption? And, what's interesting about that is no, because there isn't unfortunately, any research showing that there is a direct cause and effect that, quote, science is ready to affect, in spite of the fact that we know that it is one of the confounding genes in how our bodies end up overwhelmingly toxic. And we also know that looking for, like science is always chasing their tail, looking for a magical gene that causes all bad things that they can splice out.
Perfect.
That,
exactly
looking...
right.
Yeah, looking for a direct cause and effect completely minimizes what is actually going on in the body of somebody who's ill, in my opinion.
Right. So most of us have what's called a genetic load that's hidden because we're heterozygous. Mom or dad contributed an allele that happens to have a mutation where we get a copy that's not quite working the way that it would be best suited to our current situation. But we don't know that genetic variant in another situation would have been adaptive. And so if it confers a phenotype upon us that we call disease in the modern world, in the past, that particular phenotype may have been offsetting some other environmental factor that we don't know about. But, I'm pretty upset at biomedical research. I'm pretty upset at biomedical genetics because they do this cookie cutter, pre-K, maybe kindergarten version of genetics in their head, where, like you said, there's a single gene. If you can't show that this single gene determines the trait like eye color, then they don't know what to do. And the reason for that is, I did a postdoc at Penn State University with Masatoshi Ine, was the godfather of molecular evolution. He came out of population genetics. He was Mutakumura's student, the author of the neutral theory of evolution. And he used to point to the 30 years of research in population genetics that was mostly theoretical. But I go way back to Sewell Wright. I read all of Sewell Wright's 3 volumes, and each one of the volumes was huge. And they could understand this kind of complex interplay between polygenic traits, complex traits, epistasis, pleiotropy, all of these things. What pediatrician is going to say, oh, well, we have this, classically trained pediatricians, you have this condition, and so what I'd like to do is I'd like to do a genetic study on you and get some data for you, because the scientific studies have been done that show that condition X involves epistasis or pleiotropy or gene regulation control, and so we know exactly what we're going to do because we're going to look at multiple genes at the same time. And then I'm going to come up with a treatment pathway for you that's based on a complex understanding of multiple pathways at the same time. No, they don't. They say, all right, this is what I did for the last 4 patients that had the same condition. I'm going to write you a script. Here, let me know if it works. And come back to me if it doesn't work. And that's called diagnosis by treatment. I think it's highly unethical. It's profitable because then, well, that one didn't work. All right, let's see what else we got. Okay, the second thing that I use is this. Here, take that script.
It's protocol medicine. We have lost the art. We have confabulated the science, and we have lost the art in medicine. And I always speak about, genetics. So, and about my grandmother, who I dedicated my book to, well, both of my grandmothers, but one of them was an Italian immigrant. She lived to be 96 years old. Before her death, I had the good fortune of looking at her genetics. I've looked at mine, I've looked at my parents, I've looked at my children, and I've looked at my grandparents. Her genetics were terrible. I mean, to see it on paper, without knowing who she was, she had every marker for inflammation. She had 2 copies of C677T. She had a bunch of other confounding MTHFR mutations. She had a CBS mutation. She had a whole bunch of interleukins. Like, you would think that this woman was 50 years old on her autoimmune deathbed and, living this horrible kind of depleted life riddled with disease. Well, she graduated from high school at the same weight she died at. She walked every day. And basically she found all of her medicine, died with all of her teeth in her mouth too, her own teeth, and basically found all of her medicine in her garden. So, to your your point, our genes do not define us. They may give us some sort of a guideline as to, what we may be genetically susceptible to based on our environmental experience. But you are completely correct in that fact that we cannot prescribe one-size-fits-all medicine to anybody, largely because we don't know what their genetic expression is going to do under those confounding conditions.
Okay, so thank you for that. When what we're really talking about here is a lot of people know about MTHFR and what I've seen a lot of people post. We need methylfolate. We don't need just folic acid. We need methylfolate. But there's some people that don't need methylfolate, and yet they have the same MTHFR variation, right? And so tell us about how other genes how do you use information of other genes to interpret whether or not you might make the problem worse with different kinds of types of folate?
Right. So we all need methylfolate. That's basically like the gasoline for our cellular cars. The problem is there are people, depending on the rest of their genetic makeup, that may not be able to tolerate methylfolate in a pill, or may not be able to tolerate methylfolate even in its true form. So depending on what else you're seeing from a genetic expression, sometimes you have to kind of skirt around the methylation pathway, and as we say in genetics, backdoor it, and be able to help the body to utilize and identify methylfolate as a friend instead of a foe. So you're absolutely right. I've been doing genetic medicine for over a decade, and I was kind of one of the first, so I kind of feel a little like a dinosaur at this point. But what happened is when MTHFR and a lot of the research hit the market, 5 or 10 years ago, everybody called themselves an expert and gave high-dose methylfolate in a pure form, and were really making people really sick. So again, it's that whole, there is no one-size-fits-all protocol. And if there are other confounding genes, like a whole slew of other MTR mutations, sometimes you have to actually give more methylfolate. If somebody has another gene, like we talked about, my favorite, COMT, catechol-O-methyltransferase, that's my favorite, you can actually be what's called methyl sensitive. So you don't actually tolerate high-dose methylfolate, and you can do something called methyl trap, meaning the cells don't know really what to do with all of this methylfolate, so all of it goes inside the cell, and you basically repeat the same reaction over and over again, which can make people feel anxious, suicidal, aggressive, any number of symptoms. So sometimes you can't give methylfolate at all. Sometimes you have to use some of the other B vitamins to almost kind of, the way I describe it, gently invite the body to absorb and utilize whatever is available as far as methylfolate goes.
So let's unpack a COMT a little bit. I know it's your favorite, and I want to take the time. So we have we did the MTHFR pathway, and COMT is an adjunct to that pathway. It interacts with that pathway. What does the protein do, and why is it so important, and how is it related to MTHFR?
So the way I describe it to my patients is this. It's kind of like the garbage man of the neurotransmitter system. So it goes and it kind of picks up and degrades any kind of old, used up, crusty neurotransmitter, breaks it down, throws away the trash, and reutilizes the parts that they can reutilize. So it's kind of the easiest way to describe it. So, and the way that, it's easy to understand is if this gene is not working properly in your body, one of two things can happen. And you're either the Tigger or you're the Eeyore, right? So you're either Tigger, you're jumping out of airplanes, you're hopping all around, your sleep is terrible, you're annoying all of your friends, or you're Eeyore, you're slow, you're deliberate, you're probably chronically depressed, but nobody's actually saying that to you because you're a super nice person. So, and you kind of have to look at it that way. So depending on what the methyl demand is for those patients would depend on how you actually prescribe or utilize supplements. And so sometimes patients that are both positive for COMT and MTHFR, you can't give methyl B12 or even methylfolate at all. You have to use hydroxy or adenosyl B12, or you have to use B1 and B2, or in some extreme cases, you give no B vitamins at all and just use tiny, tiny amounts of minerals. And sometimes those patients are on a really, really restrictive diet because they're even symptomatic from some of the nutrient components in their food. So it all depends on the patient, but COMT is one of those things that has to be balanced pretty properly with MTHFR, because for example, if you have 2 copies copies of C677T MTHFR, right? We're assuming you have a high methylfolate demand because your body's going to create a lot of inflammation, and the methylfolate will actually need to be present in higher amounts to be able to drop the inflammation, so we can drop the homocysteine levels in the blood. But if you're also positive for COMT with one or even sometimes two mutations, what happens is balancing that high need for methylfolate may actually cause more symptoms in somebody than to actually try to give low levels of methylfolate and higher levels of tolerated B12. So it all depends from patient to patient. I wish there was a formula. It's kind of a running joke in my house with my husband, who's a chiropractor who sees like 100 patients a day, and he comes home and he's like invigorated and he feels like, he's helped so many people, and I come home and I like want to drink tea, and he's like, how can you not feel like I feel? And I'm like, I have to use my brain all day long, and sometimes it just hurts. So
I'm glad you brought that up, because as you were talking, I was writing down my thoughts, which, this is a hobby horse of mine. I did over 100 research studies with physicians and population genetics people, with population health, public health people, biologists and so on. And one of the bugbears that I have is, we're not really utilizing all the genetic information that we have. And I can break this down even within a single gene, right? It's remarkable to me at the time that I was at the University of Pittsburgh, at MSH2, the gene MSH2, there were hundreds of genetic variants that were in the gene MSH2. It's a post-replication mismatch repair gene associated with colon cancer. And unless the specific genetic variant that somebody's interested in happens to be above 3% of the population or in a large enough number of families, it doesn't qualify as a clinical variant. And I think the people putting the screen on what qualifies as a clinical variant do so because they want to be able to minimize the content of what's on their technology for like SNP arrays, as opposed, commercialized SNP arrays to bring down the cost, as opposed to just saying, okay, we know your variant's there, it's a change of function or loss of function variant, we know it, and we happen to know you need MSH2. You absolutely have to have a working copy of MSH2 for your cells to be viable, and BRCA1 is the same thing. My mom died of breast cancer when I was very young. My sister got it, she survived, but we had two cousins that died at the age of 25. And there's a specific variant that's segregating in my family, and it has a high penetrance at a young age. And God bless her, the genetic counselor said, listen, it's not a clinical variant because there's not enough families who've had people that die from this yet. I'm like, yeah, but we know that BRCA1 is an essential protein, and we have to have it. And we know that, if you got one good copy from mom and one good copy from dad, or one bad copy from dad, and then you get a somatic mutation in the other copy, or a gene loss, you actually lose the gene through recombination, whatever, then you're off to the races. The only copy that they have to work with is that. So the question is, and I'd like to explore this, you might not have a direct answer, but let me put it this way. Richard Fry wrote the cover to my book on autism, and I picked him to write the cover of my book on autism because he had the most diverse and most meaningful science on genetics and environment and autism. And I told him I thought he should be the next director of the NIH to get control of the situation. So let's say we got somebody like Richard Fry nominated into the NIH. How could we change biomedical research to empower physicians, the ultimate through translational research, to be able to better interpret polygenic variation in medicine, in pediatrics? I mean, this is one example. MTHFR is one example, but what kind of research should we really be looking at doing? What kind of studies should we be doing?
I don't know. Can I swear? Because I feel like I need to swear.
Yeah.
I feel like we need to. Oh, good. I feel like we need to burn the motherfucker down. Quite honestly, my grandmother is just an N of one, but there are lots of people out there whose genetics are horrible. And I think, like you said, you're given what you're given as far as genetics. I think that if we looked much more deeply at the environment and really studied the environmental influences on whatever the unique polymorphism was, that we would have have much better outcomes for health across the board at any age, even in high-risk populations like your family, for example, with that one particular gene.
Yeah.
And I think that our genetics is kind of like a knowledge is power thing. Like for a while, I was working with several scientists trying to get a bill passed that really gave, full genome, that we checked all genes at birth of these babies, and then kind of looked at it from a constitutional standpoint, which just gets into, a whole lot of other rights and exposure things that we're now dealing with as far as constitutionality. But I think having that knowledge and some sort of comprehensive education that is available to the public about genetic expression and epigenetic, influence is a far greater power that we would have as humans than to be perseverating about a particular gene and its direct cause and effect.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
It does make sense, and I appreciate you stating it that way. So, burning the motherfucker down is basically what IPAC is all about. And, what I'd like to do is create a publicly funded biomedical research infrastructure where the universities know that they can come and get access to public money donated to IPAC if they do real science. That's going to have real impact. They don't answer to pharma. They don't answer to they would answer to the public, and they would really do for the first time since 1986. They would do real public health research. They would look at this. Let me bring this up again. This science exists right here. This is not. I didn't make this up. I didn't put that together because I wanted to. This is a reflection of what the science is, and so we can induce autism with valproic acid. I put an end to the myth that we don't know what causes autism in the arguments online by saying, well, nobody knows what causes autism. I said, well, yeah, valproic acid causes it in some people and some mice. It's known. The studio that we have here is not part of IPAC, but it's what we do not yet know. I don't want to focus on, I want to know that how can we really get to the point where, like you do, you'll consider multiple genes at the same time in the same patient. You say it's excruciating and tiring, but I'm an algorithms guy. I can sort out decision trees on this stuff, and I can study people coming through your study and reflect. We could create an AI that does the thinking for you. It matches your performance almost exactly, and maybe learn something new along the way. I could literally do that with the knowledge that I have. Not to replace you, but so that you can go home and have some wine instead of some tea, or you can hang out and watch some TV or something like that's a good thing. That's a good thing. But go ahead.
I would love. Me personally, I would love to see a study of two similar control groups. One that has kind of chosen the pharmaceutical route in whatever that means. That's guided by the study, and another control group that has not. And I think a perfect example of that is looking at something like the Amish population, and the stratification of their disease. Now, they're a little bit more unique than the biodiversity of what we see, like, say, in America or some of the European countries, because their genetics are very similar. But I think, looking at humans from an epigenetic standpoint, because there's nothing that we cannot, as humans, get rid of 100% of stress. We cannot, as humans living in America, get rid of 100% of pollution. But that doesn't mean that the human body isn't abundantly resilient and can tolerate some level of toxicity at some point, as long as they are not completely and totally, barraged in every facet of their genetic, epigenetic, and, societal, existence.
Yeah, cool. Can I have you shift a little to the right? You're sliding off the group there. There you go.
Oh,
perfect.
Sorry.
That's all right. No, you look great. It's a great time to spend with you. What I wanted to do is, Dr. Kendra Bennett has, she's got some I don't know, octane in her tank. She goes home tired because she's using up all of her, brain chemistry and energy, and hopefully you're powering your mitochondria. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to show you guys that she really knows what she's talking about here. For those of you that are suffering, that have children that are suffering with eczema, psoriatic eczema, psoriasis, other autoimmune conditions, Dr. Kendra has agreed to bring forward a case study that she presented at Autism 1 here. And so would you step us through the slides here? I'll just go to the slide on case study A first.
Perfect. So this little girl was 6 years old when she showed up in my practice. She's 10 now. And she came in with 4 different autoimmune diagnoses: eczema, psoriatic eczema, psoriasis, and something else. I can't remember. And her history includes that she was a natural vaginal term delivery. Her mom was really stressed during the pregnancy. Her partner had left her when she was 5 months pregnant. So this little girl was fully vaccinated, breastfed for 6 months, but went into daycare in about 12 weeks of life. So in daycare, of course, just by the pure exposure and exogenous stress, she ended up with multiple incidences of ear infections. And of course, with each ear infection, she was treated with an antibiotic. So interestingly enough, she came into my practice because she had seen dermatologists and rheumatologists and pediatricians and all of these people that basically had no other option for her except for to put her on a biologic at 6 years old, which most biologic drugs haven't been studied in anybody under the age of 16. So it would have been a risky trial. And, biologic drugs, for the most part, have quite a high incidence of causing cancer within 10 years of use of the drug.
So give me an example of a biologic that was being considered for her.
I think they were looking at Humira at the time. And then there's another one that they were using. And you know what? I probably can see the commercial in my head, but it's one of those standard, ask your doctor if this is right for you, but it could cause
the guy's walking through the airport,
right? Walking through the airport, and there's a doctor wandering around with a clipboard, and you'll see on the screen where you shift a little to the side there, but he's walking around, and then when they get to the side effects, they play this beautiful, light-hearted music, right? So you could actually die from a stroke, or if you feel suicidal, let your doctor know. And okay, so let's go back to this little girl. She's 6 years old. She has eczema. The description of eczema, the symptoms are what?
So she was so itchy and so scratchy that the itching that she was having on her skin actually translated inside of her body. She couldn't sit still. Her sleep was terrible. She had flaking skin literally from the top of her head to the bottom of her toes. And the mother really was, doing everything that she knew how to do for this little girl and following all of the directions that these providers had offered to her. So she showed up in my office because she didn't want to do a biologic pharmaceutical with this little girl at 6 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how we ended up here.
Okay, so then we're going to the next slide.
So I do, I love lab work in my office, even for little kids. So I did a variety of lab work. So, and here's what I found. Her vitamin D level was low. I like to keep kids, between 60 and 100. And we know vitamin D is very important for healthy skin. She also had a gluten and a dairy sensitivity. And I always do IgG testing because IgG is the immunoglobulin that lives on the GI tract from the mouth to the anus. So to me, I want to have a better indicator as to how the body is reacting to food it's consuming than to look at what happens in a scratch test, which those reactions are histamine levels and their immunoglobulin IgE, which doesn't give me a good idea as to how the body's actually digesting. Sure. I did in her case check her IgE levels, which again are the throat closing allergy type markers, only because she was so inflamed. I had to believe on some level that she was systemically inflamed. So that level should really be below 30, and hers was 500. So she was over 10 times the normal. She had an elevated MCV, which is mean corpuscular volume, which means that she had kind of thicker, denser red blood cells than the average Joe. And that usually is a sign of somebody who's a poor methylator, that they're not actually methylating properly, they're not detoxing properly.
And that would come out as a symptom of anemia as well, right? So
it absolutely can. Okay. But as you know, we're on a slippery slope because when people feel like they're anemic or have low energy, they take B12. So sometimes B12 can actually mask the sign of an anemia. So it's a little bit of a slippery slope, but yes. And then I did an RBC magnesium level for her because magnesium is important in about 1,100 biological reactions in the body. And I happen to like it a lot. And here in the Northeast, people have lower levels of magnesium than they do in the rest of the country. So her level was low. I generally like to keep my patients between 5 and 6. So I did a bunch of genetics on her. We did a full genetic assay, and her MTHFR was positive, and she carries 2 copies of the C677T, and she also carries a couple of interleukin SNPs, which of course lead to the inflammation.
So let me ask you, what kind of assay is a full genetic screen here? What technology did you use?
So this was 4 years ago. I actually used 23andMe.
Okay.
Since then there's been, quite a bit of information that has come out about 23andMe. And to your point from a couple of minutes ago, what 23andMe has done is they have basically dumped a whole bunch of really important genetics that have health implications for humans and replaced them with other genes that have higher levels of polymorphism in the population, largely because they are looking, for any of you who don't know, 23andMe basically made a deal with a pharmaceutical company to de-identify the data that you're giving them. And then the pharmaceutical companies are looking at the assays, looking at the different polymorphisms across the population to make better drugs that they can, modulate genes with, because we're moving toward this precision medicine. So for those of us that did a lot of health stuff, 23andMe has really kind of been useless over the last couple of years. But this was several years ago. So
Understood. So when you come back on the screen, you're way shifted to the left. So way shifted. So
okay. Better?
Yeah, much better.
Okay.
So
right, cool.
little by little, you're like inching off the screen. It's kind of fun to watch. So
Cool.
the treatment protocol that she was given by you then would be gluten-free, dairy-free, cow dairy-free, right?
Yes. Yep.
And then.
And then I put her on a bunch of supplements. I mean, as complicated as her case was, I mean, I didn't do anything that I don't think anybody who was trained in basic biologic nutrition would have done.
Yeah.
So I put her on a probiotic, right, to help heal and seal her gut. I put her on vitamin D because her vitamin D level was low. I gave her omega-3 because omega-3s increase the oxygen carrying capacity of the red blood cell, which we already knew was a little challenge for her, and high levels of oxygen in the blood help our cells heal. Plus, of course, it's a fatty acid, and fatty acid helps reduce scarring and reduce inflammation. I gave her a chewable anti-inflammatory, which had things like nettles and NAC and vitamin C in it. And I gave her, I have a bunch of different, I have my own supplement line, but I carry a variety of B vitamins just because of the genetic predisposition of my practice. And so I gave her a particular B vitamin that had 3 forms of B12 and a little bit of methylfolate, because again, I didn't want to push her pathway so much, knowing basically she was pretty locked up because of all the inflammation. And then I used a product of mine that's called B-Top, which is actually topical B12. And so the research, the evidence-based research on using topical B12 on eczema is absolutely amazing. So I use topical B12 quite a bit with my eczema patients.
Okay.
And so, yeah.
So
it
that's
wasn't
complicated. It's complex to the newbie, but it's a straightforward to you because you've been doing it for years. But just to go over it again, you changed the diet, gluten-free, dairy-free. What is the CF and the SF diet?
Oh, sure. Corn-free and soy-free.
Well, there you go. So you're avoiding glyphosate, of course.
I am.
Now you stopped the meds, and you got permission of the dermatologist to stop all the meds. You upped the vitamin D. You gave omegas. You said eat some walnuts and chia seeds while you're at it. Right?
I did.
And get your chewable the anti-inflammatory. And so now this child, how long before you started to see an improvement?
6 weeks.
She
had been suffering
miracle.
for 4 years. Yep.
So with Richard Fry in charge of the NIH and you as Surgeon General, I think we could do some damage here. This is
my gosh,
remarkable.
we totally could.
Look at this. So, and then I guess I'll be in charge of the FDA. I'll take over translational research and make sure everything is on right for people. So after a 6-week follow-up, all the eczema is gone except for on the scalp. All meds had been stopped, which reduces the family's budget. Maintaining the diet, compliant with supplements. Let me ask you, the 12-week follow-up, she still looked good?
Still looked good. She still looks good today. It's been 4 years.
That's incredible. This is beautiful. You're a wonderful person. You're a wonderful doctor. I want to thank you on behalf of humanity for sticking with it, using that wonderful, beautiful brain you have. It's so fantastic. I mean, I went through your slides, by the way, and I'm not going to go there on everything, but you're like the other me.
Awesome.
You're like this crazy person that goes to the scientific literature and gets everything anyone ever says and puts it in a 3x5 note about every vaccine and the things that are associated with it. So I mean that. I'm saying I found this other, like, I love to play intellectual badminton, and so
it's awesome.
You're a remarkable person. I've not seen anything like this. This is not what you get at your PD. I'm not advertising for Dr. Kendra, but I would take my child to you, absolutely, 100%.
Thank you so much. I do have a caveat with that story. Okay. So the mom had another baby 2 years ago, I think, about 3 years ago. So the little girl had, the second baby had eczema on her face. So instead of the mother going through the whole route that she had done with the first child, she showed up in my office. The sister had similar SNPs, mostly in the inflammation pathways. We tweaked her diet a little bit and put her on a little bit of glutathione, and her eczema was gone in 3 weeks. That's like my fantasy. Like, if people could come to me first and I don't have to even remove the obstacles, you know what I mean? And clear out the toxicity and just deal with the initial problem. That's like my fantasy, because the body is so resilient. It's so resilient. And if we only had the opportunity to cultivate that instead of suppress it, like I believe conventional medicine does, the healing, I mean, it's miraculous. It's literally miraculous.
Okay, so let's go to the next case study if we could. This is case study J.
Yep.
9-year-old male.
Mm-hmm. So this is an interesting case. So he came in with tics and anxiety. He was treated with a fluoroquinolone antibiotic after a sinusitis infection. So here's the slippery slope on that. The American Academy of Pediatrics says do not treat sinusitis with antibiotics unless there is a fever and the sinusitis has been going on for more than 3 weeks, largely because the caverns are so deep in the sinuses, the antibiotics can't get there. Most sinusitis is either viral or fungal anyway, and antibiotics, of course, treat bacteria. But I guess this was, before she had come into my office. And so after a fluoroquinolone, this little kid developed tics. And this is like a beautiful family. I mean, they were just beautiful people. So his history was, again, he was a term baby, vaginal birth. He was breastfed for about 18 months. He was completely up to date on his vaccines, and he was healthy and very athletic. So interestingly enough, the dad was a police officer and the mother is a nurse. So I did full genetics on them, and then all three of them came into my office, and I have the little boy's genetics in front of me, and I'm going down the list, and I said, do you have a history of alcoholism in the family? And the wife points to the husband. Then I said,
wait, I gotta do this. I've looked at your child's genetics. Do you have a history of alcoholism in the family?
Yep.
It's just a wealth of information.
Wait, it gets better.
Okay.
So then I said, do you have a history of migraines? Because I'm looking at the genetics, right? And so the husband points at the wife. It turns out this little boy has a second-degree relative that actually died of an aneurysm. So they all have that as well. So, you start to feel less like a doctor and more like a psychic medium just because you're reading what you see in the genetics.
Exactly. That's what I did. It was the great Karnak, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So anyway.
So the other generation won't know that cultural reference, but that's
exactly.
The Tonight Show. The original host was Johnny Carson, and he used to do the Great Karnak, where he would do a shtick where he had an answer in an envelope, and he'd ask the question, and the punchline would be in the envelope. It was a great shtick. So the parents' faces must have been like, how does she know that, right?
I know. I was like, my job's done here. It was kind of nice.
Right.
So anyway, going back to his slides, he's positive for MTHFR. I believe he's positive for COMT, which is kind of a tricky combination with fluoroquinolone antibiotics. And he had a couple of other genetic mutations that made me think that he would have an issue with the fluoroquinolones. So, we kind of discussed the tics and what was going on with him. And I really had strong suspicions that the tics were caused directly by the fluoroquinolones. So me, in my infinite wisdom, right, because now we're going back to the Johnny Carson thing, I said, don't give this kid a flu shot. She's a nurse, right? In Connecticut, we live in Connecticut. He's not age eligible for the flu shot. In Connecticut, it's kids that are under 60 months or over 65. So this kid was 9 years old. Like it wasn't required. It was just, that stand up and jab sort of mentality.
Yeah.
So the mother says, well, he always gets a flu shot and this and that. I was like, he has a very high potential for having, a reaction with the flu shot. So we ended up treating his tics with glutathione, I think, vitamin C. It was a relatively basic protocol. I took him off gluten, which was a big thing for him. Oh, there you go. So his so here we go. His B12 was greater than 2,000. All right. So when we see B12 that's high like that, what do we know? We know that the B12's in the blood, but it's not in the cell where we need it to be.
Right.
So when that happens, we basically have like an intracellular anemia or depletion. So he's compound heterozygous for MTHFR, which means that he's at about 40 to 60% of optimal functioning of that gene. And then he was compound heterozygous from the COMT. So we know that we suspect he's a little methyl sensitive. We know that his clearing of toxicity is lower than the average kid. And he just kind of got a big hit of a bunch of toxicity with 10 days of that fluoroquinolone antibiotic. So I put him on a gluten-free and dairy-free diet. I didn't even go super crazy with his diet. I always do. My rule of thumb with probiotics is if you take an antibiotic for 10 days, you take a probiotic at twice the dose for twice as long as you're on the antibiotic. So if you're on a probiotic, if you're on an antibiotic for 10 days, you should take double the dose of your probiotic for 20 days.
Cool. That's really thoughtful. Yeah. So I have a question about probiotics. So there's some people that are saying that you should modulate the types of probiotics. So if you take the same type over and over and over again, your body can become less responsive to the type that as it's administered, that you need to have it from natural sources. You should go for foods that are probiotic as well as supplements. What are your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts differ from some of the big heavy-duty people out in public, but I will say that I'm a huge proponent of probiotics. I think they're immeasurably helpful, especially for those of us that live in a toxic society, which is all of us. Yeah. And I am also, like you, very mindful about the type and the quality of probiotic that I give to myself and to my patients. So, like, for example, I have my own supplement line, so I carry 2 different types of probiotics, all of which have only anti-inflammatory strains in those probiotics. There are certain strains of probiotics that can be histamine modulators and things like that. I also do carry a separate type of probiotic, which is a spore, which helps more with kind of the development and replenishment of the number of bacteria in the gut, as opposed to like a standard probiotic, which basically reseeds the gut. But if there's inflammation, sometimes those little seeds don't stick on the side of the intestine and you have to do some other stuff. So in this case, he got a very straightforward probiotic, 2 strains of lactobacillus, 2 strains of bifidobacterium, and 1 strain of strep. And that's the 5 strains that are in the probiotic that I make and manufacture in my office.
That's incredibly
and
cool. So where so people get that through your office? Is there a supplement? Where can people access your supplement line?
Right from my website, and I can certainly leave you the link, but it's www.fwcct.com, and I have a whole link on there, and it has all the descriptions of all my supplements and kind of how I got to where I was, because what happened is lots of manufacturers made beautiful products that I took and I swore by and I gave to my patients, and then you get that standard email, we've new and improved XYZ, which means they actually wrecked it. And so some of the stuff over the years that people have new and improved, I took the original formulas that have always been successful in my practice and utilize those formulas as the basis for a lot of the supplements I carry.
So tell me that website again. I'll type it in right now so it'll be on the screen. www.
Sure. It's www.fwcct.com.
Look how easy we are at www. Okay, did I got that right?
Yeah, you
Awesome.
got it.
Look at this.
Oh, my name
real-time
is wrong. I'm not
updating.
Dr. Bennett. I'm Dr. Becker.
Becker.
Oh, let's change that then. My bad. I've been saying Dr. Becker. My bad. I have the name Bennett in my mind for various reasons. Okay, Becker. Thank you. I'm so
No problem. I
embarrassed
just
now.
noticed that.
Look at what we
No,
can
don't
do. Look at what we can
Yeah,
do.
we're so
Don't-
fancy.
Yeah, we're so fancy. Look at this. Let me fix that. All right, is that better?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Sweet. Sorry about that. So,
No worries.
alrighty. So, you're back to your case study then,
Oh,
Kendra.
back to my case study. This is a good
Sure.
one. I like it. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just saving the settings, so it's good. All right, so let's go there.
Sure.
Okay.
All right. So, and then I gave him probiotic. I gave him some vitamin D. You know, as you see, I have kind of a trend here. I did use glutathione. Glutathione is a methyl donor, so you have to be careful with people that are methyl sensitive. So sometimes those comped up regulators, like he had the genetic predisposition for, can be sensitive to the glutathione. This child in particular tolerated it very well. So, and then of course I am a naturopath by trade, so I always do throw in some homeopathy, especially nowadays while it's still legal. And I gave him that remedy is called plumbum, and plumbum is one of the keynotes for plumbum is tic disorder. So I gave him a homeopathic. I figured, you know, he was in the office and he was really suffering, and I was going to do everything I could in my power to, you know, to clear this condition for him.
Okay, so
yeah.
as we're doing science here, and I know I'm sorry, I cut to the wrong screen. As we're doing science here, we know that the FDA is rattling sabers over homeopathy these days. Have you seen a difference in using that homeopathic plumbum versus not using it with patients that are similar to this particular case?
Yes, I love homeopathy. I swear by it. I've studied it extensively. I think it is, I think there's an aspect of magic to it. I really do. And the way I describe it to people, when I was first in practice, people are like, what is it? I'm like, it's like this. When you let your dog off a leash and the dog is far away from you and you call their name, and for a swift second, you think the dog's not going to come back, but the dog comes back every time. That's how homeopathy works. You're never sure it's going to work. You know, the mechanism that is described by science is very different than conventional scientific language and jargon and established, you know, principle and scientific fact. But it is, you know, the research studies show it works far better than any placebo, and there are no side effects. And to be quite honest, if nothing else, it can't hurt. And so what I've seen over the last 15 years in practice is there have been very strict regulations with homeopathy. Like 15 years ago, we could give patients homeopathic vaccines. We could, you know, we could buy homeopathic cannabis before cannabis was, you know, really kind of hit the market. We could get homeopathic opium, which is a great remedy for stubborn constipation. But now all of those things require DEA numbers. I mean, I have a DEA number, so it's not a problem, but you could just call up any company 15 years ago and be like, hey, I need some homeopathic opium. Can you send that over? And they'll be like, sure, we'll see it in 2 days. So it's a little different now.
Okay,
But
so
I find it to be amazing, and it works very well in combination with other modalities of treatment.
Okay, so maybe we'll come back and talk about homeopathy in a more detailed analysis, because I'm very interested in this question. Because part of me thinks, well, it's the absence of allopathy that's so healthy, right? For just generic, you know, I'm going to take a homeoprophylaxis as opposed to a vaccine. Well, the big difference there is that you're not taking a vaccine with the constituent ingredients. That's a huge effect. But here you've got, you know, a child that's on a protocol. I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Maybe 7 changes, and then on top of a homeopathic change. And I'm just wondering, for this case, would you have expected that the result that you didn't see would not have been there without him? And do you base that on experience? Do you base it on intuition?
I'd say in this case, I was going to give him everything that I knew possible to get rid of the tic, because it was so bothersome to him. Do I think he would have had a same or a similar outcome in the absence of the homeopathy? I would say in this particular case, absolutely. There are some cases that have some deep-seated stuff, and the remedy, so, you know, with homeopathy, there's different kind of levels of potency of the
Right.
remedies. So the remedy I gave him was actually a very low potency. It's what we
Sure.
call for an acute condition. So
Okay.
it's kind of one of those things, like I said, that was like the cherry on the cupcake,
Okay.
on the icing on the cupcake. It really
Yeah.
wasn't the cupcake itself.
Yeah, fair
Glutathione, in
enough.
my opinion, in this case was the,
Okay, fair enough. So you're on my list of people to bring back when I get to, kind of getting under the hood of homeopathy and maybe do some good societal discussion about why it's useful beyond what people suspect is the placebo effect. It's a very interesting question because I'm a scientist. There's some things that have happened to me in my life I can't explain, that science can't explain, can't yet test. Most of it because the right person hasn't thought of the right test, right? So
Correct.
as
I agree. Yeah.
as an administered medical option, homeopathy is certainly testable, and there was we'll get into it. It's a different topic, but there are some publications that show some efficacy. So let's get back to our case here of this young man, this young, and so we got the protocol, and what the outcome of, let's see, he had sinusitis, and he was being poisoned, and you took the poison away, and you gave him some natural health.
Anti-poison. Yep.
Right? Antitoxins.
Yep.
Okay, so after 6 weeks,
Yeah.
lo and
Yep.
behold,
He's good to go. Yep. It's a miracle. I did nothing. I got to watch.
do you know?
So-
do you know if he was vaccinating at the time? Like, yes, you said he was vaccinating. He was getting a flu shot. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So, so exactly, you see what's there. So his tics are all gone at 6 weeks, and then at 12 weeks, the mom gives him a flu shot, and all the symptoms return.
Okay.
Yeah. So the interesting thing with that is that she felt very guilty, and took a couple weeks to tell me that she did it. I mean, it's her kid. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just the doctor. I'm not going to pass
Right.
judgment on the decisions she makes for her kid, in spite of the
Right.
fact that, I mean, technically she went against medical advice, is the way I kind of look at it.
But you're not the kind of physician that's going to use your white coat as a mechanism for social control.
Oh, absolutely not. And I always
Right.
say that. I mean, as you know, I'm the doctor. I'll make the decisions for the people that I'm the parent for. But in your case, you make the decisions for the people that you're the parent for.
You're so
I can only
ethical.
offer advice and guidance. Yeah.
You're so ethical. Are you moving to Pittsburgh anytime soon?
We'll see what happens in February with our legislation. I might be.
Yeah, I showed up and I spoke with that panel. I gave comments to that panel, and I said to them that it'd be nice to have some unvaccinated kids around, because those unvaccinated kids can actually provide a social service. Because if there is a transmission chain of mumps, measles, rubella, whatever, whooping cough in a school, and all the kids are vaccinated, the immunocompromised kids are going to walk right into that school into a silent transmission chain, asymptomatic transmission. And so the unvaccinated actually provide a social service of alerting, and the chair of that committee said he was offended that I proposed that we use the health of another child to benefit the health of somebody else's kid. And it was so ironic that this is what we do with vaccines, that the whole room burst out in laughter. And all I said was, thank you for your comment. That's all I could say. I couldn't say anything more. So after the 12 weeks, he's vaccinated, the symptoms come back, and then you did what?
Then I had to fix him. So we repeated the similar treatment. We did glutathione with him. I think I gave him a little bit of vitamin C. Because she had kind of alerted me very shortly after the vaccine was administered, we were able to kind of clear up all of those symptoms in about 4 weeks. So
Nice.
20 weeks after the initial visit, there were no signs of any tics. He is maintaining his diet, and he went back to routine supplements. And this little boy's 13 now, and he is an AAU basketball player. He has the biggest feet I've ever seen, and his mother finally.
That was the homeopathy that gave big feet, by the way. By the way, guys, homeopathy will give you big feet. You heard it here first on Unbreaking Science, WWDNYK Studios. goes, get some prophylactic homeopathy or some kind of homeopathy, you get your big feet, and okay, so there you go. Anyway.
Yeah, there you go. There's our PSA for the day. So anyway, and gratefully, the family has come to their own awakening. Those kids have not been vaccinated since, and so for that, I'm grateful. That I was able to provide that kind of level of education. And sometimes, I've heard it more than once where parents kind of need that validation to be able to see the direct cause and effect. I think it honestly scared her, and not that I think people need to be scared into making decisions, but in her case, it was very effective.
Well, I mean, also it's a reverse. What's the experimental design called? Where you start. It's a reverse. It's ABA experiment where you start a treatment, then you stop the treatment, then you start it again, which is really a fundamental step towards causality, I would say. I mean, it's reversibility is a element of causality. If you can turn it on and turn it off and turn it back on again, then that's pretty amazing. So you are prolific. You have multiple books out. Your PowerPoint presentation is as dense as mine. It took forever to load, with tons of information. And yet you have this book. I think this is the one that came out, Kendra, in 2018 called All You Can Eat. So what inspired this book and what's inside of it?
Sure. So again, it was dedicated to both my grandmothers. One grandmother is an Italian immigrant, first generation, and the other grandmother was from Austria and Russia, and she was second generation. And both of them were really no-nonsense women that lived into their 90s that really taught me that most of what you can find for healing is found in your backyard garden. And so I wrote this book really for my own self-healing. After the birth of my son 10 years ago, I ended up with my own struggles with histamine problems and leaky gut and all kinds of imbalances. And, here you are, it's like physician heal thyself. So I had my own kind of awakening. And what I realized is I like to call food like normal things, but not actually have it be the standard American diet, garbagey stuff. So I gave everything a normal name, like chicken parmesan and cheese enchiladas and things like that. And really what I did is I modified each of the recipes for the variety of healing diets that I actually recommend in my own practice. So I use the paleo diet a lot. I use the anti-inflammatory diet a lot. I use the GAPS and SCD diet a lot, and every single one of those recipes is gluten-free.
And I noticed looking through the book that you have actually labeled all the recipes according to which diet it complies with.
Exactly correct. Yep.
So you have a description of each diet. This looks like a great resource. I also noticed, and it's not a criticism, but I also noticed that you don't have a lot of extra ingredients. That a lot of your recipes are fairly straightforward, but I'm sure that they're all delicious. And I can't wait to try like the roasted garlic soup and whatever. It's going to be great.
So, and that was the whole thing. When I was doing my own healing, I had 2 little kids. I was still practicing. I'm married. And it was like I couldn't go home and make these elaborate anti-inflammatory meals. I needed something quick and nutrient dense that everybody in my house would eat and that we all could just, heal and balance our own bodies with. And so that was really the whole thing. And the other thing I hear from a lot of my parents and patients is, we travel, we can't, stay on XYZ diet when we travel. And so I made the book really thin so you can stick it easily in your suitcase. You can, rent a house or stay in a place with a kitchenette. You can order your groceries online, have them meet you wherever you're going, and you can continue to stay on track while you travel.
That's brilliant. So
can't use that as an excuse in my practice.
So here you have it, Dr. Kendra Becker, and I'll make sure that the files are labeled right at YouTube so people understand, and your website's right. That this is one of the most intelligent physicians I've ever had the pleasure of speaking with, ladies and gentlemen. I'm gonna embarrass you right now because I spent all morning listening to your presentations and doing my homework, and we could go for pretty deep into the pathways, but it's the nimbleness and the flexibility of problem solving, the parallel thinking and the flexibility, the plasticity that you have in reacting to changes in the information that comes your way, that you call it an art, and there is an art to practicing medicine. There's an art to, but I think you're much more of a scientist than a person that follows a checklist. You're much more of a, you're using the powers of observation. You're using the powers of certainly the experience. I'm trying to change the world with what I do at a larger level, not a greater level. You're changing hundreds of lives, and that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. I'm trying to create a community of physicians and scientists that really will lead our path into a cleaner, brighter future. And so, it really upset me in studying autism that they shut down all the science on that you'd be able to cite published studies testing your protocols if the NIH had their funding priorities right. But they don't, because if they funded biological approaches to autism, then that would show it's reversible, which means it's not genetic, and therefore something in the environment's doing it, and maybe those crazy parents that said thimerosal and aluminum had something to do with autism might be right. And so what I'd like to do is ask you, did you publish these case studies that you told us about?
I actually have not published them. I got permission from both of the sets of families to use them, and they've literally traveled around the world with me. Yeah. It's funny because I just had somebody approach me maybe within the last month and said, you've got to put a few more details in here and publish these case studies. And so it's on my computer in a file, and I'm going to move toward that, I think, because I have a couple of others that are very similar, that are just basic protocols. Like, none of them that I've seen really the most profound success with have been anything that is super duper crazy complicated. And that's what I think is the real take-home message.
Well, no, I think it's very important that you do publish it. And I'd also, as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Science, Public Health Policy, and the Law, what I'd like to do is talk with you when we're done here about setting up a place where case studies like yours that you do can be published, and they go against the grain of the mainstream. The mainstream won't publish this kind of thing before the reversibility. I mean, that's right. And so if the case studies are published, and then you also have an editorial that helps interpret it appropriately and tells the whole big picture, I would love to see you start a line of case. If you started a line of case studies in that journal, Science, Public Health Policy, and the Law, then we could help people understand why this particular case study is so important, as opposed to, it's more translational, I suppose, but more than happy to have you consider it. All right, so I'm going to look at this from a perspective of, we went for an hour and a half almost. Oh my God, I can't believe how far we got in the first 33 minutes. I looked at the clock and I'm like, wow, we're really cooking. I want this to last. She's so bright and brilliant. But I would encourage you also to take a look at, I'm going to self-promote here, this paper that I wrote on autism is an acquired cellular detoxification deficiency syndrome with heterogeneous genetic predisposition. I think that probably nails it. I'll send that to you. It's open access.
Awesome.
And I'm also going to send you a copy of the environmental and genetic causes of autism as a copy that when you go through it, if you see things that are missing, obvious things that are missing, and citations, I'm going to ask you to think about giving me some feedback on if I do a version 2 on this. I probably won't, but I would love to know what you know. You certainly taught me a lot today. I couldn't be happier with how this went. This is the first in a series on MTHFR. You knocked it out of the park. The community has been telling me that, Jack, you need to understand MTHFR. So you're an excellent teacher, and I used to know something about it, but I didn't really understand all the pieces of the puzzle. So I humbly thank you. I want to give you the last parting words here. What's some words of inspiration for people that are trying to get their own physician to address the illnesses in their children? They don't live in Connecticut. They live in some ungodly place that has physicians that follow the book. What do you say to parents like that who want to make their children healthy?
So I would say the first thing is that you have to turn your cell phone off, turn your Wi-Fi off, and just sit with your kid. You know what I mean? And see if you can pick up something intuition-wise that you know is out of balance with them. That's number one. Number two, standard naturopathic, medicine is remove the obstacles to cure. So get rid of anything that is fake, phony, artificial, inflammatory, and, and just not real food in their diet. I think the diet is huge. I think the diet's probably 80 to 90% of it. I do have an online e-course that has 8 modules it's called Keeping Healing in the Home, that has all of this stuff in there. So it might be a nice foray for parents that are kind of, stuck, backed into a corner and kind of stuck with conventional medicine. Gives them an opportunity to just really start from the very beginning with diet and, non-toxic products and certain things we can do in our home, increasing the amount of outside and fresh air we get, even in a city, is beneficial. Vitamin D, probiotics, things like that. So those things can be very, very helpful on the outset. And then what happens is sometimes that level of awakening dials you in, to the right people or to your tribe, and then you may be able to find a doctor or a provider that can help, guide your healing toward the next step.
So your suggestion
the other thing is,
go ahead.
But
Sorry.
I was going to say, and the other thing is sometimes you get a lot of really good information from moms, and you don't need to, and then you can find that one doctor to help fix the mold toxicity or help support methylation or whatever it is. So you don't feel like you have to jump in 100% and relinquish your child or your health care over to this system. You're just getting help and guidance in one little area.
Is there some book that you think would be that would help pediatricians revolutionize the way that they think about this and learn more about what you know? Is there some resource they can go to?
There's a book. Yeah, there's a book by Dr. Mendelsohn that I think is called What Your Doctor Won't Tell You. I'll get you the exact name. I don't have it here. I literally travel with it. Like that's nice. The book I read on the airplane. But it was written, I think, in 1987, and he talks basically about this, about non-toxic living. Of course, it wasn't called that in 1987, and about using your maternal intuition and keeping the toxicity out of your kid's life. And one of these days, maybe we can get a grant through your foundation, hint, hint. I'm going to rewrite that book for modern times. That's really what I think is going to be my life work, and it just talks about minimizing toxicity, using your own maternal instinct and wisdom about that your child, the one that you made and you carried and the best, to be able to guide them through their life and allow their lives to be as healthy as they can be.
Okay, so what size grant are you shooting for? What would it take to get Dr. Kendra Becker to write this beautiful book that we all want to see written?
Well, if you're going to do all the research, we probably could do it for $150,000. If I have to do the research, I probably need about $250,000. Because now I got to go out of the country, right, to go to all the places that the research isn't censored. So I'll have to do it.
What would be amazing if a camera crew followed you around and you ended up with a Netflix series or something like that, you did it, and then, people are so videos. Andrew Wakefield says that, documentaries are where it's at. I put a lot of time and effort into this thing, and the people that pretend to read it, I've got a bunch of moms that they did this for me as marketing. They're like pretending to read it, and some of them have actually read it. Some of them have struggled through every word. It's very densely written, but what this was supposed to be was a snapshot of what I thought the science said what autism was. And it was not for parents, it was for academics to say, look at guys, we know. This is what we know. Okay, right. So you're just a fantastic person, and I'm so happy to have had you on, and I'm going to fangirl for a little bit longer. And thank you. Your patients are so lucky, fortunate to have you. And if there's ever anything I can do or my community can do to get behind you and with any kind of support that we can do, certainly let us know. Okay, Kendra? And
Awesome.
thank you again. I'm going to play the on the outro, if I can get it up here, and you will be off screen, but I promised you some music. So this is the Nokomis sound bug that I play. Unbreaking Science. Thank you, Dr. James Lyons-Weiler. Basically cutting out. And your mic's still live.
I'm your host, Dr. James Lyons-Weiler, aka Dr. Jack. In this episode, we're going to review the evidence that science is broken. This is not a true story.
Will be told, the people will know the price of corporate science really taking its toll. Whistleblowers blow, public health data low. They say the science is settled, but how do they know?
Science.
Ask questions, critically think, you should try it. It's pure, unadulterated science. Unbreaking science.
Unbreaking science.
You can't deny it, you sure can't buy it. Fact check, use your brain, don't be quiet. It's pure, unadulterated science. Unbreaking
Unbreaking
science.
science.
Using the tools of the trade to back up what we say. You can't be silent when it comes to unbreaking science. That's like the truth of next level ultraviolet. You got a hypothesis, do a critical test. Make an observation without being biased. Use logic and reason mixed with evidence. Look for patterns and results with significance. Calculate them numbers, real accurate, or else your findings won't be legit. Don't cherry pick, but be skeptic. Cause broken science, it makes us sick. That science is being funded by the very same people that run it, so they can promote a product, so they can make that money. Try not to laugh, cause this ain't nothing funny. All these science-like activities, no joke, they call them studies. Hand-picking sample groups and no true placebos. Losing public trust the more and more that we know. The truth will be told, the people will know. The price of corporate science really taking its toll. Whistleblowers blow, public health data low. They say the science is settled, but how do they know?
Unbreaking science.
Ask questions, critically think, you should try it. It's pure, unadulterated